The Witch King of Angmar was no ordinary servant of Sauron. He was the greatest of the Nazgul, the lord of the Ringwraiths, a being of such dark sorcery and malice that even the bravest warriors of Middle-earth trembled at his presence. But what made him so terrifying? Why did even Gandalf, the most powerful force of light in Middle-earth, find himself surprised by the true extent of his power? To understand the Witch King, we have to go back to the days when he was not yet a wraith, when he was still a mortal king, powerful, ambitious, and hungry for dominion. His true identity is never revealed, but what we do know is that he was one of the 9 men who accepted the Rings of Power from Sauron, and that was his downfall. The ring granted him immense power, strength, sorcery, influence beyond measure, but at a cost. Slowly, over centuries, he faded into shadow, his will no longer his own. His body became a spectral husk, invisible, bound entirely to Sauron's will, and thus he became the greatest of the 9, the leader of the Ringwraiths, a nightmare given form. But here's the thing. His power wasn't just that of a wraith. He was no mindless spectre. He was a warlord, a commander, a sorcerer whose strength only grew over time. He crushed Arna, the northern kingdom of men. He wielded magic that broke the spirits of his enemies long before his blade ever touched them. And most importantly, Sauron gave him something that even Gandalf had to be wary of: dark sorcery unlike anything else in Middle-earth. Gandalf had fought many enemies in his long existence. He had faced Balrogs, creatures of shadow and flame. He had resisted the influence of Sauron himself, withstanding his corruption while wielding one of the 3 elven rings. He had battled countless orcs, trolls, and dark creatures in his quest to guide the free peoples of Middle-earth. But the Witch King was something different. When Gandalf returned as Gandalf the White, he was no longer just a wizard of the Istari. He had been sent back by the Valar, reforged, more powerful than ever before. He had broken Saruman's staff with a word. He had defeated the Balrog of Moria, a creature of pure fire and shadow, something so ancient and terrible that it had once fought in Morgoth's wars against the Valar themselves. And yet, despite all of this, despite standing at the very peak of his power, Gandalf did not take the Witch King lightly. Why? Because the Witch King was something even more insidious than a Balrog. A Balrog was raw destruction, elemental fury made flesh. But the Witch King was a master of fear. His mere presence could break the wills of even the bravest men. His voice alone could drive warriors to madness. And unlike a mindless beast of flame, he was cunning, intelligent, and utterly relentless. He had a will that was bound to Sauron, and through that connection he drew upon power far beyond that of an ordinary wraith. And then there was the prophecy, a single line of foresight spoken long ago by Glorfindel, an elf lord of immense power. Far off yet is his doom, and not by the hand of man will he fall. At first glance, this prophecy might not seem significant, but to those who understood fate, to those who knew how prophecies in Middle-earth tended to unfold, it was an ominous warning. It meant that the Witch King could not be slain by any man, not by a king, not by a warrior, not by any of Gondor's greatest champions. It meant that even the most powerful mortal figures in Middle-earth were utterly helpless against him, and that alone made him terrifying. But did Gandalf underestimate the Witch King? That's where things become even more interesting. Gandalf had faced Sauron's forces before. He had seen the Nazgul, fought against their fearsome presence. But he had never faced the Witch King directly, not in battle. He had never stood alone against the full might of the Lord of the Nazgul, empowered by Sauron's will, strengthened by sorcery, unknown to even the wise. And so, when the gates of Minas Tirith shattered beneath the power of the Witch King, when he rode forth from the darkness, crowned in unseen fire, something happened that no one expected. Gandalf hesitated. Even as he sat upon Shadowfax, staff in hand, ready to confront the greatest of Sauron's servants, there was something in the air, something different, a presence that went beyond just fear. The Witch King wasn't just a dark spectre, he wasn't just a powerful foe. He was doom, incarnate. And for the first time, Gandalf saw it firsthand. And that was the moment that changed everything. Minas Tirith stood as the last great stronghold of men, the beating heart of Gondor, and the final defense against Sauron's relentless war machine. It was a city of white stone, its towering walls carved into the mountainside, layered and fortified, built to withstand siege after siege. But as the armies of Mordor gathered beneath its walls, stretching as far as the eye could see, a terrible truth became clear. This was unlike any battle Gondor had faced before. This was annihilation. The sky darkened unnaturally, the sun choked out by black clouds that swirled from the east. Drums pounded like a slow, relentless heartbeat, growing louder, closer. Then, from the depths of Mordor's ranks, the Nazgul came. 9 shapes on black horses, their shrill cries splitting the air like daggers in the mind. Even the bravest soldiers clutched their weapons with shaking hands, their bodies betraying them as a cold dread crept into their bones. But among the 9, one was different. One rode at the head of the others, a figure clad in black armor, a crown of unseen fire upon his hooded head. The Witch King of Angmar. And as he moved, so too did fear itself. Sauron had unleashed his most powerful weapon. The Witch King was no mere general. He was terror given form, a force of destruction that could not be stopped. Wherever he rode, the enemy crumbled. Shields dropped. Swords fell to the ground. Men forgot their oaths, forgot their courage, and ran. The battle raged, but Minas Tirith held, for a time. Then came the battering ram. It was called Grond, a massive siege weapon shaped like the head of a snarling wolf, forged in the fires of Mordor, its very name a relic of Morgoth's wars in the First Age. The ground shook with every strike. The gate groaned, but it did not break. Again and again. The rams thundered against the wood, sending cracks splintering outward. The defenders fought desperately, arrows and fire raining down upon the attackers. But it was only a matter of time. And then, silence. The soldiers on the walls stopped. The rams ceased their pounding. The air itself seemed to hold its breath. And then, from the darkness, came the sound of a single horse's hooves. The Witch King had arrived. Slowly he rode forward, alone, his presence making the very air grow heavy. He lifted his hand, and the black sorcery of Mordor swirled around him. A deep, unnatural voice, something beyond words, beyond human understanding, rippled through the city. Fear spread like wildfire. Those who had not yet fled felt their legs weaken. Some collapsed where they stood. Then, with a mere whisper of power, the great gate of Minas Tirith, stone and steel, a fortress within a fortress, was shattered as if it were made of glass. Through the broken remains, the Witch King rode into the city. None dared to move. None could. The defenders of Gondor, men who had spent their entire lives training for this moment, found themselves unable to lift their weapons. The power of the Nazgul was in more than just their strength. It was in their will, the sheer overwhelming force of their presence. And there, waiting for him in the ruin of the gate, was Gandalf. The old wizard sat atop Shadowfax, his white robes gleaming even in the darkness, his face set in grim determination. He did not move. He did not flee. He did not falter. The Witch King halted, his unseen gaze locking onto the white wizard. A moment of absolute stillness. Two beings of immense power, light and shadow, wisdom and malice, staring each other down in the ruins of a once proud city. Then the Witch King laughed. It was not the laugh of a man. It was cold, hollow, and full of something ancient, something cruel. "You are foolish to stand before me, old man." Gandalf remained unmoved. He tightened his grip on his staff. "You cannot enter here." The words were firm, spoken not as a challenge, but as an unshakable truth. The Witch King dismounted. A long, curved sword appeared in his hand, its blackened steel gleaming in the pale light. "Do you not know death when you see it?" And then something happened that no one had expected. With a simple motion of his will, the Witch King lifted his hand, and Gandalf's staff shattered. It was over in an instant, the weapon of the White Wizard, broken, useless. Gandalf's expression flickered, just for a moment. Not fear, but shock. The Witch King stepped forward. His presence alone seemed to press upon the very air, suffocating everything around him. "This is my hour." Gandalf, the White, the strongest of the Istari, the slayer of the Balrog, the wielder of Narya, the fire of Anor, had never faced anything like this. This was power beyond mere physical strength. This was a force that did not just kill its enemies, it broke them. And for the first time, the possibility entered his mind. What if he could not win? What if this was truly the end? But just as the Witch King raised his blade to strike, it happened. A sound shattered the air, not a scream, not a cry of terror, but something far more terrible. The horns of Rohan, a sound like thunder rolling across the plains, deep and resonant, a sound of hope cutting through the suffocating darkness. The Witch King stopped. He turned, just slightly. His attention was pulled away, and Gandalf, still seated atop Shadowfax, released a breath. Not relief, not yet, because something had just become very, very clear. Had the Witch King fought to the end, had he not been interrupted, this battle may have ended very differently. The Witch King turned away, his attention shifting from Gandalf to the battlefield beyond. The horns of Rohan still echoed across the fields, their sound rolling through the ruined city like the first breath of a storm. For the first time in this war, the darkness had been answered, not by fear, not by retreat, but by a force that Sauron's armies had not accounted for. Gandalf sat motionless atop Shadowfax, gripping his broken staff, watching the Witch King's reaction with keen eyes. The Nazgul Lord did not hesitate, did not linger. He did not turn back to finish what had begun. Instead, he mounted his fell beast and took to the sky, soaring towards the Rohirrim like a vulture descending upon fresh prey. And that was the moment that changed everything. Had the Witch King stayed, had he pressed the attack, what would have happened? Would Gandalf have stood against him, even without his staff? Or had the Dark Lord's greatest servant truly reached a level of power beyond even Middle-earth's most powerful wizard? The question lingered, and it remains one of the greatest what-ifs in all of The Lord of the Rings. Because unlike Saruman, who had fallen to arrogance and complacency, the Witch King had no such flaws. He was not a wizard undone by his own schemes, nor was he a creature ruled by emotion. He was single-minded, relentless, a force of pure will. And it is that will, not just his sorcery, not just his strength, that made him something Gandalf had never truly faced before. A Balrog was a creature of rage and destruction, but the Witch King? He was death itself, given intelligence, given purpose, given the full might of Sauron's dark power. And the most terrifying part? Gandalf knew that had the battle continued, he might not have won. But fate had intervened. Rohan had arrived, and in that moment, the battle for Middle-earth shifted. The Witch King, who had shattered the will of thousands, who had broken the gates of Minas Tirith with a whisper of power, who had stood on the very brink of ultimate victory, was pulled away. Not by defeat, not by fear, but by something far greater, by war itself. The Rohirrim swept onto the field, their cavalry thundering against the tide of Mordor's forces, their charge a defiant answer to the darkness that had sought to swallow them whole. And the Witch King, rather than finishing his duel with Gandalf, turned his full attention to them. This was not a mistake, it was a calculation. Because the Nazgul were not mindless monsters, they were not creatures of brute force. The Witch King was a commander, a strategist, a warlord who knew that the battle was far from won. He saw Theoden at the head of his riders. He saw an opportunity. And just as he had shattered the will of men before, he sought to do so again. With his fell beast shrieking like a dying soul, he descended upon the King of Rohan, sweeping into the fray with a vengeance that shook the battlefield itself. Theoden never stood a chance. The great king, the mighty leader who had defied Saruman, who had led his people through exile and despair, was crushed beneath the weight of the Nazgul's assault. His horse, struck by the beast's talons, collapsed beneath him, throwing him to the ground. And the Witch King knew this was the moment. He would finish what had begun at Helm's Deep. He would break Rohan's hope as he had broken Gondor's. He would make the world understand that no force, not elves, not men, not even wizards, could stand against him. But then one voice, a single voice rising above the chaos. "Be gone, foul Dwymerlake!" A woman, Eowyn. She stood between the Witch King and her fallen king, her golden hair whipping in the wind, her sword raised, her eyes burning with fury. And the Witch King laughed. A cruel, cold laugh, the same laugh he had given Gandalf at the gate, the same laugh that carried the weight of prophecy. "No man may hinder me," he declared. Because he knew the prophecy. Because he knew no man could slay him. And in that moment, as he raised his weapon, as he prepared to strike down yet another foolish mortal who dared to stand in his way, he failed to realize what was about to happen. Eowyn removed her helmet. Her golden hair spilled free, her face fierce and unyielding. "I am no man," she said. And then she struck. The Witch King, the Lord of the Nazgul, the terror of Middle-earth, screamed. It was a sound unlike any heard before. Not the shriek of a Nazgul's cry, not the wail of death he had inflicted upon others, but a sound of his own agony, a sound of doom. Merry, unseen, forgotten, struck with his enchanted blade, severing the sorcery that bound the Witch King's form. Eowyn, with all the fire and fury of Rohan, drove her sword straight into the darkness where his face should have been. And the prophecy, the words spoken centuries before by Glorfindel himself, were fulfilled. Not by the hand of man, but by a woman, by a forgotten hobbit, by fate itself. And as the Witch King of Angmar collapsed, his form vanishing into nothingness, his terrible will unmade in an instant, something else became clear. Had he fought Gandalf to the end, had he pressed that battle rather than turning to Rohan? Would the prophecy still have held true? Would Gandalf have fallen? Or did fate ensure that the Witch King's doom was always meant to come at the hands of those he least expected? The greatest champion of Sauron was gone, but the war was not yet over. The Witch King was gone. His terrible shriek faded into the wind, his form vanishing into nothingness, his will unmade by a force he never expected. For the first time in centuries, the battlefield felt different. The shadow that had loomed over Minas Tirith, that had strangled the city with fear, had dissipated. But what did it mean? For so long the Witch King had seemed untouchable. He was more than just a wraith. He was the ultimate manifestation of Sauron's will. He commanded armies, shattered gates, and bent the will of men with nothing but his presence. He was a sorcerer, a warlord, a terror that had existed for generations. And yet, he was gone. Slain not by a king, not by an elven lord, not by a great warrior of renown, but by a woman and a hobbit. How could this be? The answer lay in the prophecy. Not by the hand of man will he fall. At first, the words seemed like a riddle, an enigma woven into Middle-earth's fate. But now, in the moment of his destruction, they became clear. The Witch King, for all his strength, for all his sorcery, had a doom written into the very fabric of time. He was powerful, perhaps even more powerful than Gandalf had anticipated, but he was never invincible. Because power alone does not define destiny. And that raises a question. If the Witch King had finished his battle with Gandalf, would the result have been different? Would Middle-earth have lost its greatest champion? Or was the Witch King's fate always sealed, written in words older than he was? To understand the answer, we must look beyond the battlefield. For centuries, the Witch King had grown in power, feeding off the will of Sauron, becoming something greater than a mere wraith. His magic was ancient, his strength tied not only to the ring he once bore, but to the very essence of Mordor itself. He had the power to drive fear into the hearts of the bravest, to dominate those who opposed him. Even Gandalf hesitated before him, and that, more than anything, was a sign of just how dangerous the Witch King had become. Gandalf was no ordinary wizard. He was not merely an old man with a staff, nor was he just another member of the White Council. He was a Maya, an immortal spirit from before the creation of the world itself. He had faced Sauron in the Second Age. He had battled a Balrog and returned stronger than before. He had wielded the flame of Anor, the secret fire that gave him the strength to challenge the darkness. And yet, in that moment at the broken gate, as the Witch King stood before him, something happened that no one expected. Gandalf did not strike first. He did not cast Sauron's servant aside as he had done to Saruman. He did not command the winds, summon fire, or smite his enemy with a word. Instead, he waited. Why? Because the Witch King was different. This was not a battle of brute strength. This was not a contest of spells. This was something older, something woven into the very nature of Middle-earth itself. The Witch King did not simply wield power, he wielded fate. And Gandalf understood something that no one else did. The Witch King was not meant to fall by his hand. It was not his destiny to end this creature. Even if Gandalf had fought, even if he had given everything, would the outcome have changed? Or would the prophecy have held firm, ensuring that the Witch King could only be undone by one who was not a man? Fate had played its hand. The battle at Minas Tirith was not Gandalf's battle to win. It was Eowyn's. It was Merry's. And in that truth lies one of the most powerful lessons in Middle-earth's history. The greatest forces in the world, wizards, kings, warriors, could not always dictate how things would end. Sometimes victory came from the unlikeliest of places. And that is why Gandalf was surprised by the Witch King. Not because the Witch King was stronger than him, not because he feared defeat, but because he understood that there were forces at work greater than power alone. He understood that in that moment, at that gate, something far greater was unfolding. And as the battle raged on, as the fate of Middle-earth was still being decided, one truth remained. The Witch King had fallen. But the war was far from over. Sauron still watched, and Mordor had not yet.